Hello, I'm Don O'Coin, theater critic of the Boston Globe. Thank you for joining us for this roundtable on creating anti-racist theater. It has been 1 month, almost to the day, since George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, was killed by Minneapolis police. Since that time, there have been protests across the country demanding an end, finally, to racial injustice. Many institutions have been examining the ways in which they have contributed to systemic racism. This long overdue reckoning has extended to the theater. We have with us today 4 of Boston's leading theater artists to talk about how the theater industry can respond to this historic moment, how it can play a role in the racial justice movement, and how a truly anti-racist theater can be built. They are Kirsten Greenidge, a playwright who is the author of such works as Milk Like Sugar and Luck of the Irish. Summer L. Williams, Associate Artistic Director and co-founder of Company One Theater. Michael J. Bobbitt, Artistic Director of New Repertory Theater in Watertown. And Maurice Emmanuel Parent, an actor, director, and the co-founder and executive director of the Front Porch Arts Collective. To those of you who are watching at home and wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen. Kirsten, I'd like to start with you. Very few playwrights have grappled more consistently with questions of race and class than you have, and your plays have been produced in theaters around the country. From your experience and your observations, how pervasive is racism in the American theater? What forms does it take? How does it manifest?
I would say that it is quite pervasive in that I think in mainstream theater, many of our audiences happen to be predominantly white. So we're often, I think a lot of times playwrights in the mainstream theater are often writing for the white gaze. And so we feel those pressures. And we feel, I think a lot of times writers feel pressure to perform for white America. And that can affect our voice, and it can affect the market that we're writing for. And then it can also affect the conditions under which we write, and the homes that we write in, the rooms that we write in as well. So I'm speaking from a playwright's perspective. I'm not an actor. I'm not a director. I'm not necessarily a producer either. So I can speak on that level in terms of the pressures of a playwright in the room, in the industry. I'm hopeful for this moment as people begin to do a lot of introspection in terms of how do we change, how do we look at ourselves and our actions. But I think that there's a lot of work to do in terms of the type of work we're asking our theaters to produce, or that we have produced for many, many years. I think that we have a lot of space for change right now. And it can be very damaging to work under those conditions as well.
Yeah, I want to get to the question of the work still to be done. I guess I'd ask Michael to also weigh in on this question of how pervasive racism is in the American theater and how it manifests.
As she said, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And first of all, a couple of things I wanted to say. One is that I just want to be clear that equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-white supremacy, all those things we're fighting against is an act of love and not an act of war. We're trying to show love to people that have been excluded and violently abused in this world. And so all those people that think we're starting a race war, what we're trying to do is end a race war in this country. So it's super important that we stay focused on that. And then when we talk about racism, and I'm a big fan of Ibram Kendi, and I'm so happy he's coming to Boston, but this notion of racist and anti-racist, and how not racist is not a thing that exists. You can't be not racist, but still perpetuate and still benefit from the privileges of being white in this country. So your only choice is to be anti-racist. So when we talk about our theater companies, it's everywhere. And I like to, I mean, right now I'm really working to fight the systems, because I do believe that there's a difference in culture and policy. And oftentimes culture is hard to change because you have to change people's minds and hearts. But policy you can change. If you look at the Civil Rights Acts, that was a policy change, but people still hated Black people. So to me, go for the policy, go for the systems. So I'm looking at things like subscriptions, which I think are totally a racist structure. Who has the money to buy their seats a year and a half in advance? What seats are they buying? Are they leaving brown and Black and poor and young people sitting in the back and the sides? And at general admission, so not having tiered ticketing, because to me, tiered ticketing gives people that have a lot more just for having a lot. We're looking at donor benefits so that all donors get the same amount of money. I am pushing hard against my board because to me, the 501c3 model is another sort of racist structure where your volunteers, your donors, your wonderful people have ultimate power over the organization, who don't necessarily have expertise in theater. There's so many things I think, and even like how we do budgets. I mean, I know now as the world is moving so fast, I can't even like predict a year and a half in the future. Like it's just it's a strange thing that we are doing in the nonprofit world. And so the only thing you can do is base your budgeting on past trends, where if you're like New Rep and you're a predominantly white organization, you're basing it on maintaining the status quo. And so gone are values-based and inclusion-based budgeting is really based on keeping those that have on the top. So to me, it's everywhere. Beyond like the culture, it's in the policies, it's in the systems, it's in the financial structures. And those are the things we have to really fight and push against.
Thank you. Summer, to you, you and I had a conversation about 7 years ago that's never left my mind, where you told me that you were mindful that were it not for Company One, which you co-founded, adventurous theater, that you might not, as a young woman of color, had the opportunities as a director, and you've gone on to have a very stellar career. Could you sort of speak to that within the context of what we're talking about? What obstacles you anticipated, what obstacles you experienced, how you surmounted them?
God bless the child that has his own, right? There's something really, I was raised hearing that often. And one of the things I think about in terms of like white supremacist structures and how, where we are all complicit. And one of the ways I understood like, oh, here's how I'm complicit. I'm complicit because I actually have been abiding by the rules of this structure. So as soon as I opt out, as soon as I say no more, as soon as I say, I'm going to figure things out on terms that I actually value, on terms that are intrinsically important to me, then the world widens. And so, and of course, I was a younger person when I co-founded Company One Theater, and my younger self believed it was just a means of creating opportunity in a world that I felt, quite honestly, hadn't been meant for me. I was 15 when I attended Freedom Theater, and Wesley Montgomery, who was my assigned mentor there, introduced me to Ntozake Shange's Spell Number 7. And there's a monologue that is like 4 pages long by a character named Natalie. And she talks about all of the different versions of white women that she might need to become in order to find her own sense of self and sense of success in this world. And at the end of it, she says, like, I'm so glad to be a Black woman. And basically, I read that in my 15-year-old body and felt like, oh, I understand. Here I see someone who is trying really hard to fit into all of these paradigms, all of these tropes, and understand that nope, none of these worlds they weren't necessarily built for me, but I can construct the world for myself and bring others into it. And there's something really powerful about that. I have no doubt that were it not for Company One Theater and my kind of foundational involvement, that my career would have been different, because I was not on the educational path that would get me into some of the larger theaters that you need to be in order to be seen. That's the structure of supremacy that we need to start to dismantle. And it starts like not just at the regional theater level, not at the not-for-profit, not at the community. It starts in the arts education. It starts like really, really early, because there were places in which my young heart and mind were really interested and like really desired to be in the world of theater, but yet I understood that to be a white space that wasn't meant for me. And I had to figure out how to make it for me. It's a long answer to your question, but it's much deeper than the founding of something. It's also more about a self-awakening, I think.
Beautiful, thank you. Maurice, could you tackle that question too, please?
Sure. I have a few thoughts in response to my wonderful colleagues who've already expressed so much. So I agree so much with what I've heard so far. And I just think of it from the different hats I wear, and I think as an actor, and I think how like anti-racism starts from the individual, and in theater starts from every theater participant changing their mindset. Kind of like what Michael said, it starts like everyone has to be a participant in anti-racism and anti-racist practices. And I think so then you start asking yourself questions. How often are Black actors asked to relive their trauma just to work? You know, how many plays are written in which we can live fully, and not only live fully in our relation to whiteness, right? And how many what plays are being selected for being produced? Why is it so radical to try to create in the theatrical space a Black or POC affinity space? And I'm speaking specifically to The Front Porch. My hat as a producer. The Front Porch, our co-production of Passover. The director, inspired by the play What to Send Up When It Goes Down, decided that after each show to create a space of healing for BIPOCs, people who might have been triggered or had visceral responses to what they just witnessed, and just asked white patrons to maybe just leave the space and create this healing environment. And the amount of fighting we had to have, the arguments, the pushback, and I'm just saying, like, all I'm trying to do is provide a space that my white colleagues get to benefit from on a regular basis. You know, you don't have to walk down the street, as many of us do, for blocks in the city that we all know and love and live in, and see the only person on the street that looks like you is maybe someone who's homeless and on the corner. You know, like you don't know on a firsthand basis how that gets into your mindset and your perspective, when literally for blocks walking in some of our theater areas, you don't see anyone that looks like you, right? You have to find those, you have to create those spaces, you have to seek those people out. So I think about that. I think about how we can use theater to dismantle the normalization of whiteness and white folks. So I mean that by saying, I think sometimes our work is judged as Black art versus art. So for instance, I have been, and some of my colleagues say that we'll perform in a show and then we're compared to each other. We're compared directly to more famous Black folks. And that's kind of saying that you aren't seen as an artist just in of yourself. You're seen in respect in relationship to what I have predetermined before I came into this artistic space, what Black art should be and what it should look like, versus I think some of my white colleagues can just be artists and be judged and seen for the merit of what they're producing just in of themselves. So it's, you know, it's, and then the other thing I want to say is, as a theater participant and a friend, and to many, it's, the conversation has to be with people who are not Black. When you talk about anti-racism and you ask me to help you understand this moment or understand the conversation happening nationally, thank you for asking me. I understand that you trust me or whatever, but you have to realize that this conversation is not just an idea for me. It's not just a news story or something. It's not just something any human can see that a Black man being suffocated on the street is horrible. Any person with a heart can see it's horrible. That's great. Thank you. Now you have to realize that for me, I'm seeing this horrible situation. But I'm also thinking that could have been me. If that police officer who pulled me over last year had been the guy who pulled over George Floyd, I would not be here today. So when you're engaging me and asking me to engage in these conversations, it has to be on my terms, because it's not just an intellectual conversation, it's a deeply emotional, triggering conversation that I need to be able to process as a human before I can process as any type of thought partner. So it's just like in these conversations, in these moments, how can you be anti-racist in the ways you approach people, the ways you approach the space, the ways you think about what you're saying and what you're not seeing, and how you can support that, and how your knee-jerk reactions might be based in how you benefited from systemic racism, and you need to unpack that. And it's not my job to do it.
Thank you. What is the responsibility and the potential of the theater industry? I guess I'll begin with Kristen again, when it comes to responding to Black Lives Matter and to the kind of wide-ranging, deep-rooted problems you've just described. I mean, can this moment of national reckoning be reflected on stage in terms of new works, pre-existing works that deserve and need a wider audience? What are some of the stories that need to be told on stage now?
I think it's dangerous to ask a playwright who's a teacher, because a playwright who's a teacher, I would say, a great plethora of stories need to be told all the time. So my philosophy of playwriting is that the table is wide enough for all of us, and big enough for all of us. And the problem is that I think sometimes we believe that we live in a world of scarcity, and that there's not enough room at the table for all of the stories. So I believe there's enough room at the table for all the stories, and so that the responsibility as a theater community and wider world is to figure out, how do we make room for all these stories? In this particular moment, especially in this moment where theater is paused, I think it would be a good idea for those of us who hold a deal of responsibility to look at seasons while seasons are paused and see, do they reflect the voices out here that are crying for recognition? And if they don't, perhaps taking a look at how they could better reflect the voices that we're hearing in our public arena. So if in this moment of pause, while we have the chance to redraft and relook and talk and recognition, I mean, if in a moment where I go to buy these books for my kids about anti-racist thought, and I can't find them anywhere, so everybody's buying them up. So in this moment, if we look at it, we try to figure out what we want to program, and we come out to it and we have the same plays by white authors, by white male authors on our stages come next May, if we're all open in May, then there's a problem. So this, I think, is a responsibility to relook at what we're planning to put on our stages, and also how we look at theater and how theater intersects with community. What is the theater space for? And I think that's the responsibility of who makes the theater, but also in who goes to theater as well. What are we looking for the theater to do in our communities? Because I think theater is able to do many, many things, not just entertain, and possibly not just teach as well, and possibly enter into a lot of different types of conversations. I do a lot of talkbacks. And oftentimes talkbacks are ways for playwrights to try to explain the play. And I think that there's a lot of ways, other ways that theaters can engage with community, as opposed for the playwrights to just explain what the play did. My play is a way to engage with the community. I think theaters have other ways to engage with community and create conversation and dialogue. And it's an exciting moment in that way. But I think it would be great if we could take this many months long time to really do some deep introspection. which is
Don,
difficult.
can I?
Mhm, go
Sorry.
ahead, Summer.
Sorry, I just want to jump in for 1 second and say it's really telling. We heard in terms of like some larger theaters in New York are talking about what they're programming on already and what's come to the forefront. I think it's really important that theaters are also really honest with themselves about the community they serve and who they want to be serving. I think we've seen plenty of models where it's very clear that they're not necessarily interested in reaching a particular community. I don't advise people decide to start now because it's in fashion. I think people have to really take stock of who they are as an institution, who they want to continue to be, and then we can continue to make choices about where we want to go, where we want to work, where we want to be affiliated, etc. But I think this moment where I've never gotten so many emails from corporations, like places where I've shopped in the past, telling me how they feel about Black lives. That does not necessarily signify to me anything different, because I haven't heard how your board is being restructured. I haven't heard about how you are dealing with how you're marketing and your advertising. Like, there's so many other things that people can really focus on to show where they stand and what their values are. But I think people deciding like, oh, and now's the time to articulate that this is how we feel about a thing after we have all of this history that kind of shows us something else, that has to be dealt with, that has to be addressed in order for there to be real forward movement.
Yeah, yes, please, Michael.
I don't think there's anything more important right now in the world, maybe, than the anti-racism work and recovering from COVID-19. And I actually think the anti-racism work can help you recover from COVID-19 faster. Because if you become a fiercely anti-racist organization, you're going to have access to so many people that you never allowed or didn't feel comfortable coming to your theater coming. And so there might be money on the table that you have not taken advantage of. The other thing I will say is that as a producer, I have never been attracted to stories that glorify people of colors or marginalized people's trauma on stage. And I think in American theater, we are so inundated with those kinds of stories, and we have very few stories that are about the contributions of culture of people of color in this country. When you see a show that's about a marginalized person, usually it's reduced to being what that thing that makes them marginalized. And that can be re-traumatizing for a lot of people. So I hope American theater in this moment will start writing plays and commissioning playwrights to write shows that are about joy and about our contributions to the country. We still need the historical context, but let's center some plays around Black joy. Let's find a way for us to really celebrate who we are and what we have brought to this country.
And I agree with. This is a
Go ahead.
Raise my hand at any rate. And I'm a teacher. I should know better. I agree with that wholeheartedly, Michael. But and I also think theater is a political act in of itself. So I think that also in the focus of joy, how can we also create spaces where we are looking at issues that need to be brought in the power of theater, putting experiences you may not have firsthand knowledge of, one might not have firsthand knowledge of, clearly on the stage, and then also think about narratives that aren't usually on the stage that need to be explored in a firsthand experience by the audience. So I'm thinking of our trans community, I'm thinking of our disabled community, I'm thinking of our fluid community. There's all these narratives and people that have felt not included in the canon as it is right now. And I think we can focus on joy, but I think that for me it's looking at things that evoke possible trauma, but does it always, the way that a lot of things that I've been a part of is that trauma, and this also centers whiteness because it's about that relationship to whiteness where we examine the trauma. Can we examine the issue without it centering on the oppressors, And those are, I'm not a playwright, but those are the kind of questions I'm having. Like, how can you do deep dives in these conversations and use the fact that theater, what holds a mirror to life, right? It is a political act to make art. So how can you use that and stay true to it, but then also get to the root of the issue without focusing on like white supremacy?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that, I guess, with Kirsten, what Marie said about theater. Is there something, theater will never have the audience that television and the movies has, obviously, but is there something intrinsic to the nature of theater that can help advance racial justice season by season, production by production, play by play, and help sort of drive out, do its role, its part anyway, in driving out racism from American life? Could you speak to that a little bit, the sort of quality of the exchange that happens in live theater and how that might move the needle on what we're talking about?
I mean, I think what is intrinsic in what happens in a theater is that it is a human to human interaction. So it's human beings interacting on stage. I think that if we're looking for theater to drive out American racism, that's a pretty tall order, given that there's something that intrinsic in the way that America has been built with racism entwined within it. So if we're looking to do that, I think that we might all see failure in a way. If we're looking to try to build a more anti-racist society, I think we can get there by building an anti-racist theater. But I think I don't know. I think that that theater has the ability to create change.
Mm-hmm.
I do not know if necessarily trying to find one big, huge play that's going to go out and change everybody's life is necessarily the way to try to go about doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that many people who go to the theater can have an experience where they can all have a perspective shift.
Mm-hmm.
And that theater does have the ability to do that, where you sit in the theater and you say, wow, I did not see it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I did not see the world that way. And now after this experience, something in me has shifted, and that we are able, as theater makers, we're able to do that. And in this particular moment, we have the responsibility to try and create work that is able to do that and fight racism that way.
Mm-hmm.
I know that as someone who began her work in the theater trying to do that work, what's exciting about this moment is that I see more and more people doing that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I don't know if one play or sets of plays can do that. I think it's a very tectonic type of movement.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
Yeah, Maurice said it, theater is inherently a political tool. And I think that there is not a play that doesn't have some sort of social justice or political agenda to it. Again, I go back to policy and culture. Theater can help change culture and change minds and hearts and belief systems. But even that is a tall order. And I think a lot of the ways that racism ends is when you can put a personal face onto the problem. I saw a photo yesterday where this guy in a wheelchair, white guy in a wheelchair, was holding up a sign that said Black Lives Matter. And then above him, there was a sign that said, "I'm so sorry, I'm late to the game. I had some learning to do." And I thought, that's amazing. That's amazing. I was looking at the questions in the chat box, and I'm sorry to pivot, but I think it sort of addresses this, that this notion of anti-racism is like major surgery. It's like major surgery. And so many people go into this world without any education around it. And so you trying to have conversations about privilege and white supremacy and anti-racism is very hard because people are coming to the table with not enough education. One of the worst things to happen to the word racism is from the 50s on, it just became about a single act or a person who hates brown and black people. But that person benefits the same as people who like black and brown people that are white. And so it's just a difficult conversation. It's kind of hard to sort of come up with the words, but I think theater can support the cultural shift. I think I'm with Kristen that to have it fix the problem, it's a super tall order, and I'm not sure if that's possible. I think it has to be both cultural and policy change. And I think that, you know, I have a lot of my friends that think that racism will never end, and it makes me really sad. Because I think when you put that out there, you have sealed the deal. And I think, and it's sad that people live their life without hope. I think we made up this pseudoscience in these policies. I think we can eradicate them and get rid of them. It's going to take a lot of people being willing to give up power and include people in their lives. And Kendi again says that you have to have hope. We wouldn't have, who would have guessed that the 13th Amendment would have been passed? We've seen how that's been tweaked, but who would have guessed that would have happened back then? It made so much money. The wealthiest people in the world were slave owners. For that to end, given how much that industry fed American economy, who would have ever guessed it would have gone away? So we have to have hope, but theater can't fix it all.
Yeah, the word hope, I don't know if you read the interview in American Theater Magazine with Idris Goodwin, but he was saying he feels more optimistic in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests. And Maurice, I'm wondering whether you feel encouraged, and you and I spoke recently about post-pandemic life, and you talked about how eager you were to get back to that. Do you feel a particular urgency in light of this historic moment when you talk to colleagues in terms of like, what do you see as the work you want to do and make your focus from day one, acknowledging you've done a ton of work already?
Sure. Well, a few things. Well, there's a few parts of the question. The first is my reaction to the hope given the protests post George Floyd's murder, and it's hard to feel hopeful when they're in the moment of feeling that there might be some huge systemic change and big social change during these protests. Then how many people have already been killed since the protests were really getting national coverage? And so then it really is hard to hold out hope, but you do want to hold out hope. And there's me, as we speak right now, apparently in the comments, there's some type of a trolling happening of some horrible things being said as we even having this conversation. So it's hard to even have hope when that is happening. It's hard to have hope when I'm trying to create a Black theater. I feel I have to work 3 times as hard as my white colleagues or white counterparts to even justify our existence. Why there would be a purpose to even have a mission-focused Black theater. So it's hard to hold on hope. But so then there's Maurice, the artist, who just met theater as a young age and found a space that he could feel at home and create characters and be other people, and in the 4th grade. So there's that Maurice that can't wait to be given a difficult character to unpack. But then there's me, who is a Black man who is building this company, that's thinking maybe this might not be the time to go right back to the theater. This might not be the time to put people at risk. This is a thought I'm currently working through. Talk to me tomorrow, I might have a different response, but this might not be the time to rush back into it. Might be the time to sit and think and strategize and have these conversations like all my 3 colleagues have brought up in their responses, and really say, how can we come back new and different? Because the work begins when predominantly white institutions, not only it begins with hiring people of color, but then that is not the end of it. You have to rethink every aspect of how you're operating, who you are, and welcoming those narratives, not just on your stage, but from ticket buyer all the way up to board chair, your sensibilities have to change, and then you have to be willing to do that difficult work. I mean, I know people ask like, how do we change our companies? What do we do? And I know that's a question that was asked, and I just did an experiment like half an hour before we started. I looked up anti-racism consultant in Google, and like a whole plethora of things came up. So just in that question of the fact that, and I'm not shaming anybody. Thank you for asking. Thank you for putting it out there. But in that question of asking, what can we do to be better? You're saying like, I start questioning like, how seriously do you want to be better? Because you're asking me to do something that would have taken you 20 seconds to do on Google, right? So then how serious really are you? And number two, I am a Black man in America, and I have my privileges, but also I'm disadvantaged by the system that we're all trying to unpack. So you're asking me, who already is on the negative end of the racism conversation, to also help you fix it within your institution. So like, I'm also I'm also emotional because of conversations that are happening around racism that make me fear for my life and fear for the life of my family members. And then on top of that, I have to point you to an organization that can help you do the work yourself, you know? So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a tough time. And then literally as we speak, nonsense is happening. I just got a text, and I just can't, that's the world we're living in. But you know what? We will not be crushed.
Can I say, I just want to go back to Summer's point about a little bit ago. Is like, the question is, how can we be anti-racist, but also how willing are you to also, how willing are you to envision a different way of being? I think that's the moment we are in, an entirely different way of being, of restructuring how we live in this country, how we appropriate everything in this country. And I think that's the moment we are in. It doesn't just have to do with race. It also has to do with our money. And when you put all those together, people, I do not know if we are really ready to talk about that in this country. People do not want to give up what they have because people in this country believe that they worked really hard for what they have, or their parents did, and therefore they are entitled to it. And I'm not sure we're ready to have those conversations.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to some of the reader and audience questions that have been submitted. And Summer, I guess I'll turn to you. This question is, how will producing organizations and theatrical bodies actually be held accountable for the statements that they've made in support of Black Lives Matter? What's to keep them from just holding steady until time moves forward and they can just pick up where they left off?
Depends on if you're going to show up. Like, you hold them accountable. Like, not only person asking the question, but like, we are responsible for establishing what accountability means. And a big part of that is deciding, am I going to see that show? Am I going to work at that theater? Am I going to participate in a way, sorry, there's construction, in a business as usual manner? And that's a choice that we all have to make. And that's a choice that we need to kind of figure out. We need to sort of be mindful, be watchful, be present, pay attention, and then make decisions based on that information. And I think and we can't ignore that capitalism is a part of this conversation. And your vote is extremely powerful, and so is your dollar. And so the moment you apply your vote to something, or the moment you withhold your dollar, there is an opportunity for someone to understand that, I need to do some learning in order to get one of those things that I want very badly. Mm-hmm. And that's the individual power that we all have right now, and we can employ right now.
Thank you. This question seems best posed to Michael, given your experience in Maryland running a children's theater for many years before you came to New Rep. The question is, how can we better address anti-racist drama with children's theater? I think the person means stage and present anti-racist drama in children's theater.
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say every time I look at Summers Square, I just keep reminding myself that I really, really, really want to see a Prince musical. I really, really want to see a Prince musical. But
And I really, really want to direct it. So let me know.
all right, so Prince people call us. Um, the the wonderful thing about children, I mean, racism is taught. It is taught. It is not natural. It is taught. There's no sign that the science that race is. This race is a pseudoscience. So that's an opportunity that we have, because if we can get those kids really young and show them the world that we want, then they might grow up being anti-racist. So again, it's the same thing. Make sure that there's representation, make sure there are stories, make sure that the people behind the scenes on the boards making decisions are inclusive of the community that you live in, and then make sure the work you're producing is well done and presents stories that are about all of us. That's kind of a short answer, but that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I'll start with Maurice, but anybody else can chime in after that. This question is, what are you looking for from millennials and Gen Z activists that we haven't seen yet?
Oh, wow. What are we looking for from millennial and Gen Z activists? I can't be more impressed with the millennial and Gen Z activists I've met and encountered and heard, and can lead the way. I think there's a power to having grown up with the world at their hands. Like in that comment, and I said, like, how do I find, like, when I say the world, I mean like these things, you know, they grew up since children. Like I used to teach preschool, and even like preschoolers, if I left my laptop open, they would start using the touchpad. I'm like, you can't even read yet. You know, you're over there like about to open up an email. So it's amazing how the power that they have and the voice that they have through that power and through social media. And it's, you know, so like the issue of like, where do I go for anti-racism? They would have been Google that thing. They would have had a tweet about it, a snap, you know? So I just am constantly impressed. What more do I want from them? I can't really answer because I don't want to, I guess I don't want to speak for a group that I'm not a part of. And I feel I don't want to be the older person telling the younger folks what to do. Like, tell me what needs to happen, because I have had so many years in it, I'm in the business. I'm always excited and nervous, but I think that's part of it too, to be shown areas of where my thinking hasn't quite expanded to yet, in ways I need to rethink some of my preconceived ideals or what have you, and then we can explore this, and I might be like, actually, that's something that's at the core of who I am, so I'm going to pull back from that area and stick true to this, who I am as a person, but being willing to go in the direction of conversation that the younger folks bring to the forefront. It's exciting.
Anyone else want to tackle it? Summer, Company One places a great premium on younger audiences. You've been pretty successful in building that.
I would simply say, lead the way in terms of what you want to see on stage, off stage, the stories that you want to be told, write the things, demand those things get produced. Like, don't ever stop challenging. I think one of the, I know, Company One Theater, when we founded, there was a lot of, we came in heavy with some big chips on our shoulder about what we saw going down in the Boston theater scene. I certainly didn't feel like I felt my voice was reflected in any way. And I know all of the other co-founders felt the same way and wanted to figure out. So we've been in this college process where we were able to make theater our own thing. And it was very important and meaningful to us. And then we go out into a professional world and not have that same experience. It is yours for the taking. You are what's next, literally. And so help us, show us all the ways that we can support you, show us the ways that we can step back and get out of the way. Show up for what matters to you. Be really clear when it doesn't matter. And then let us kind of work together to make sure that all of the doors are wide open.
Mm-hmm. Kirsten, I'm wondering, building somewhat on what Summer said, what Boston's biggest blind spots or failings are?
I mean, I think going back to this, making room, I think there could be more space for more room at the table for more work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's incredibly hard. It's incredibly expensive to do work here. So when it's incredibly expensive to do work, there's not as much work able to be done. And it puts barriers. And I mean, I teach at Boston University. I teach at the School of Theater, and I desperately want to be able to tell the people who are graduating to stay in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can't afford to stay here, there are other cities that make it more palatable to go and do theater.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be able to say, you know, Michael Bobbitt's here, stay here. Company One here is here, stay here. I want to be able to say that. But when it's difficult to produce here, to get your work done here, to get reviewed here, all those things, to get attention here, particularly if you are a theater artist of color, if you have to fight so hard to live here as a person, not just as an artist, but as a person, and if you have to fight so hard to be an artist here, there are other places that can make it not so difficult to be a human being. And if part of what we do as artists is to take in the human condition and then interact with other humans and be on stage with each other, we shouldn't have to be so exhausted to do our work. And sometimes as an artist of color, it is exhausting just to live. And I cannot advocate for my students to be exhausted all the time. And so I think that there are sometimes other cities where you do not have to be exhausted 105% of the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, Michael, please. I was going to go to you actually with the question of, go ahead, say what you were going to say. But.
Just briefly on that, and then we can do the follow-up question if you want. But just as somewhat of a newbie, this is my 11th month being here. The one thing that I find unique about this community is that the level of education and academia that exists within certain people's body is a barrier to anti-racism. Like their ability to have intellectual conversations about why they're not racist is unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. And at the same time, that tremendous amount of education, and you would think that those people being academics or having so much education would be obsessed with learning about this work, but the discomfort they have and their ability to sort of academia around the conversation prevents them from doing more work. And so you just can't change their hearts and minds because of the level of academia. I've witnessed that and seen that and experienced that a tremendous amount.
You are the first Black artistic director in the 36-year history of New Rep. When you and I spoke in early 2019, you said to me, quote, "Theaters need to get to a place of equity, diversity, and inclusivity in a way that is more about social justice than about optics." He's also said it's a big part of who I am. In many ways, it's why I do what I do. I've become obsessed with making sure that people that look like me and people from diverse backgrounds know it, meaning New Rep, is their theater. I would ask, are theaters, and this would be a question that I would pose to everyone, still more preoccupied with optics than with social justice and true representation? And Michael, how goes your mission at New Rep vis-a-vis making your audience more diverse?
You know, the American theater has been pontificating about this issue for 20, 30 years, and we've made this much progress. Because a lot of the work is still about optics. One thing I will say is that because we're artists, we're brilliant at imagining what the world could be, but maybe we struggle with how to fix the systems, how to create models, financial models to help us work through all those things. There's a ton of tokenism. There's a ton of I mean, like we just talked about it, there are a bunch of people that put out statements in solidarity, but there's no action to support it. And it just happens all the time. And I think this talk about being exhausted is that, because we see people saying, I like people of color, I want them on my stage, and yet there's no action to really support that. New Rep has been in a transition period, adjusting to me and my philosophies and principles and business practices. We are still doing it. The one thing I will say, and I will promise everyone, is that, and this is what I think all theaters need to do, every single policy, procedure, operational practice, financial model has to be looked at from a race equity lens. It has to be. And the issue that we have at New Rep and at most theaters is that the people that are looking at those levels, those things, those practices, procedures, policies, financial structures are homogenous. They're homogenous. And so they can't see all the ways that they do business are inhibiting their ability to do what they say they want to do. That's why we have to have more representation in the room. That's why we have to have more people at BIPOCs in leadership positions and on the board and on the staff, because you bring a new perspective. And when you do that, I mean, in the Vision 2020 that I was handed when I was interviewing for New Rep, race equity and equity, diversity, inclusion was all over it, And that's one of the reasons why I took the job. And part of what I want to leave this world is I want to be able to go into predominantly white organizations and make them fiercely anti-racist, so that in 5-10 years, it looks like the community we want to be in. But it requires us making, and I think Kristen said it, you have to really look at dismantling and structuring and rebuilding. And a lot of times what we do is that we go in and we try to tweak what we already have that may be broken. So it might be better to throw it out and start all over. And so I wrote a paper for stage directors and choreographers that maybe it's time for us to do what we do well, which is to use our imagination and imagine the world as a better place, the world that we want to see, it, utopia, whatever that may be. And then we collaborate with entrepreneurs and economists and social scientists and race equity experts and futurists to help us build the business structure to support the imagination and the idea that we want.
Summer, do you want to tackle that as well?
I knew you were coming to me, Don. I felt it. Gosh. So I have a couple of strong thoughts about this. One is, I think theaters have an opportunity to do some like deep in the marrow work. And I'd like to figure out a way for us to be able to watch them do that work. Because I think transparency is key. So there's so many miles to go. We are so far from the mark here in Boston. And there are a lot of reasons. And I think if we don't start to unpack all of the ways that the theater is like a microcosm, a small lens view on some of the other things that happen in the city of Boston proper, and the way that Boston works really hard to maintain its segregation, to maintain its lines that divide folks up into neighborhoods, and structures that keep us from experiencing a vibrant sort of downtown Boston like I feel I can see in most other major American cities, and go into a space that's considered downtown and not be the only one or one of a handful. I think Boston theater is very reflective of the city and its practices. And so I think those things have to work hand in hand in order to start to disrupt and untangle a lot of that mess. And they have to want to do it. I think this moment is really important. I do believe that anti-racist work is important and achievable. I agree that policy and culture are two different things, and it's much easier to, not much easier, you can kind of attack policy in a different way that you can get at culture. But I think for theaters, understanding what their culture has been or is just as important as examining that policy, because they might have lots of policy and a lot of language that says we create this feeling and this is our environment in the space. But if you look at the culture, people's experiences are probably different. And that has to be addressed in some way in order for there to be true forward movement.
Maurice, could you speak to that? Because I'm thinking of Front Porch, and Front Porch was clearly an attempt to change this environment, but sort of speak to that if you could.
Sure. Kind of off Summer's point, art is an extension of culture and advances culture, right? So that is the way that the culture of the theater, the culture that it creates in the theater, and the larger culture that it tries to impact is how change can and will happen, if I'm going to take the optimistic view of that. And with Front Porch, it is a culture of Boston that inspires us, because unique to Boston, that is what over a 50% Black city is now, with the spotlight city, over 50% Black city, that has so many different cultures within the African diaspora that are beautiful and varied, and creating from ground up a culture that says we recognize that diversity, we recognize the umbrella, like saying Black culture is this big umbrella term and we all fall into it. And I think it's a system of white supremacy that just assume that Black culture is just this monolithic thing. We are just as varied and diverse and have different perspectives as any other human beings, and that should be celebrated. You know, I have certainly performed in many shows at predominantly white institutions that focus maybe on one section of the umbrella that is Black culture, you know, and creating opportunities from ground up that respect the diversity I spoke of, and then also can build a culture of audience engagement and staff and board, that these practices will be second nature, because the culture on stage will be reflected fully backstage, the audiences will be fully diverse, and once we are at if we achieve our dreams, the audience will be fully diverse, fully representative of Boston's actual dynamics, Boston's actual landscape. So I'm excited by the work. It is certainly a Herculean task. I'm just so moved by the conversation around culture, because being a transplant, but who's been here almost 20 years now, is to, as much as we're kind of pointing out the ways that Boston needs to improve, and rightfully so, or needs to put their attention on, going into like Roxbury or Dorchester, or teaching in Dorchester, and meeting the young people, and meeting the communities that have been here forever, and knowing that before I came to Boston, what I thought of Boston was Cheers, you know, and then going and seeing like, oh my God, Boston is so uniquely rich and diverse in a way that I have not really witnessed before, and being motivated and wanting to build a culture, a theatrical culture that will celebrate the culture I witnessed as a transplant.
Don, can I say something really quickly?
Of course.
That I'd like to maybe offer an opportunity. I think this format for this discussion is fantastic. And of course, I love talking to these folks. I would encourage, in terms of the next layer of potential accountability and looking at the Boston theater landscape, is that for those institutions that identify as a PWI, a predominantly white institution, for leaders of those institutions to participate in a conversation like this, because that's just as powerful. They're like, sure, we can have this conversation among a group of, you know, Black folk talking about creating anti-racist theater and doing that work. And that's important because we have to be heard. But it's even more important to get folks who are running institutions that identify as PWIs in conversation about, this is what we're looking at. These are the structures we're thinking about. These are our initiatives. This is what we're laying out. And in this time where we are literally, and thankfully, being asked to be still and reflective, that time is really ripe for growth and change. And I would love to see the Globe host like a part 2 of this conversation with those institutions and those leaders answering some of the questions that we have been.
Thank you. Good idea, Summer. I've been made aware that there are inappropriate comments on the Facebook Live, and I'd like to apologize on behalf of the Globe. The Globe is taking action against those individuals. I was just made aware of that. We have now reached the end of our hour. It's been terrific. I want to thank you all so very much. This has been really excellent. Thank you again.
Thank you.